My date rejected me because my zodiac sign didn't match her crystal's energy. We were sitting at a small two-top near the window, the kind of place where the tables wobble and the menus are laminated. It was early evening, still light out, and the air conditioning was too strong. I remember that because I kept rubbing my hands together to warm them. She was across from me, stirring her drink with a straw even though the ice had already melted. I had just finished telling her about my job, not in detail, just enough to answer her question. I said what I did, where the office was, how long I'd been there. She nodded, but her eyes drifted down toward the table, then to her bag on the chair beside her. Can I ask you something kind of random? She said. I said sure. I smiled because that's what you do on first dates when someone says that. You assume it's going to be something harmless. When's your birthday? She asked. I told her. I even said the year, though she didn't ask for it. It's a habit. People usually do the quick math anyway. She stopped stirring her drink. She didn't look up at me right away. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out a small cloth pouch. It was purple, faded, tied with a thin cord. She held it in her palm like it had weight to it, like it mattered how she handled it. Okay, she said slowly. That makes you a Leo. I said yes. I didn't see the point in correcting her, even though I'm technically right on the edge. Close enough. She nodded again, but this time it wasn't the polite nod from earlier. This one looked like she was confirming something she already suspected. She opened the pouch and tipped it slightly so I could see inside. There were a few small stones, smooth, cloudy, different colors. One was green, one was milky white, one was dark purple. This is my main crystal right now, she said, picking up the purple one between her fingers. It's amethyst. I've been working with it for grounding and clarity. I didn't know what to say, so I said, oh. Not dismissive, just neutral. She watched my face closely, like she was checking for a reaction. I kept my expression calm. I didn't want to be rude. People are allowed to believe whatever they want. The thing is, she continued, lowering her voice slightly, amethyst doesn't pair well with Leo energy, especially male Leo energy. I laughed once, quietly before I could stop myself. It wasn't loud or mocking, it was just reflex. I thought she was joking, the way people sometimes exaggerate astrology stuff for fun. She didn't smile back. I'm serious, she said. I've learned the hard way not to ignore that kind of misalignment. I felt my face get warm, not angry, just caught off guard. I leaned back in my chair a little, putting my hands flat on the table. Are you saying, I asked carefully, that that's a problem? She hesitated, then nodded. It is, for me. There was a pause. I could hear dishes clinking behind the counter. Someone laughed at a table near us. The normal sounds of a restaurant kept going, which made the moment feel more exposed, like we were frozen while everything else moved. But we're just on a date, I said. We're just talking. I know, she said. That's why I wanted to check early. I don't like wasting time. She placed the crystal back into the pouch and cinched it closed. She didn't put it back in her bag right away. She just held it there, resting on the table between us like a third presence. I've ignored signs like this before, she said, and every time it's turned into chaos, emotional imbalance, power struggles. I end up feeling drained. I opened my mouth to respond, then closed it again. There were a dozen things I could have said. I could have joked. I could have pushed back. I could have told her I don't believe in that stuff. None of it seemed useful. So what are you saying now? I asked. She exhaled through her nose like she'd already made the decision and was just walking herself through it out loud. I don't think we should continue this, she said. Not romantically. The words landed heavier than they should have. It wasn't that I was invested in her. We'd known each other less than an hour. It was the suddenness of it, the certainty. You're rejecting me, I said before I could stop myself. Because of my zodiac sign and the crystal, she added. It's the combination. I nodded slowly. My hands were still on the table. I noticed one of my fingers tapping without me meaning it to. Okay, I said. She looked relieved, like she was glad I wasn't arguing. At the same time, there was a hint of disappointment on her face, like she wished I would fight harder or try to prove something. I hope you don't take this personally, she said. I think you're nice. I just have to trust my tools. I didn't answer right away. I was trying to decide whether to say anything else or just let it end. The server came over then, holding a notepad, smiling automatically. Everything okay here? She asked. My date spoke before I could. We're actually going to close out, she said. Separately. The server glanced at me, then nodded. Of course. As my date reached for her wallet, she finally put the pouch back into her bag. She stood up a moment later, slinging the strap over her shoulder. It was good meeting you, she said. Yeah, I said. You too. She paused like she might say something else, then thought better of it. She walked toward the door without looking back. I stayed seated, staring at the empty chair across from me, the condensation ring her glass had left on the table still visible. I paid my bill, left a normal tip, and walked out into the heat. It had gotten darker while we were inside. The streetlights were on, and the air felt thick, like it hadn't decided whether it wanted to cool down or not. I stood on the sidewalk for a minute, looking at my phone without actually checking anything. I didn't text anyone about it right away. Not because I was embarrassed exactly, I just didn't know how to frame it. If I said she cut the date short because of astrology, it sounded like a joke. If I said she rejected me because of a crystal, it sounded like I was exaggerating. But that was literally what happened. We'd matched on a dating app about a week earlier. Her profile wasn't unusual by the standards of the app. She had pictures hiking, one with a friend at what looked like a rooftop bar, one candid-looking shot in a coffee shop. There were a couple of references to wellness. She mentioned yoga, journaling, intentional living. None of that raised any flags for me. I'd gone out with people into that stuff before. Usually it meant green smoothies and talking about boundaries, fine. She hadn't mentioned astrology in the messages, not once. Our conversations were normal. Work, favorite places in the city, a brief exchange about how bad the dating scene felt lately. She used complete sentences. She asked questions. That alone put her ahead of a lot of people. When she suggested meeting in person, I agreed without hesitation. We picked a place halfway between our neighborhoods. Casual, not loud. I got there 10 minutes early. She showed up on time. That also felt like a good sign. Looking back, there were small things I'd noticed but dismissed. The way she paused before answering certain questions, like she was checking in with herself first. The way she touched the necklace she was wearing when she talked about past relationships. At the time, I just thought she was thoughtful, maybe a little guarded. I walked to my car and sat inside with the door open, just breathing for a minute. The radio was still on from earlier, some talk show I hadn't been listening to. I turned it off. On the drive home, I replayed the conversation in my head, trying to figure out if I'd missed something, if there was a moment where things shifted before the crystal came out. There wasn't. One second we were talking about work schedules. The next second, my birth date was apparently a deal breaker. When I got home, my phone buzzed. It was a text from my friend Mark asking how the date went. He knew I had one. We talk most days, mostly about work and whatever stupid thing annoyed us that day. I typed, deleted, typed again. Finally, I wrote, she ended it because my zodiac sign didn't match her crystal. He responded almost immediately, LOL. Then another message, are you serious? Yes, I wrote, dead serious. There was a pause. Then, that's a first. I didn't reply after that. I tossed my phone on the couch and went to the kitchen. I poured myself a glass of water and leaned against the counter, staring at nothing. I wasn't heartbroken. I wasn't even that upset. I just felt unsettled. Like I'd stepped into a version of reality where the rules had changed without warning. I thought about my last few relationships. None of them had ended for a reason that clean or strange. Usually it was slow, misaligned expectations, someone wanting more or less than the other, long conversations that went nowhere. This was different. This was immediate, final. The next day at work, I told a watered down version of the story to a couple of coworkers during lunch. I framed it as a funny anecdote. They laughed. One of them shook her head and said, people are wild. I laughed too, but it felt slightly off, like I was laughing at something that hadn't fully landed yet. Later that afternoon, I got a notification from the app, a message from her. I stared at it for a long moment before opening it. Part of me hoped she was going to say something like, hey, I was nervous and overreacted, or I thought about it and realized that was silly. Instead, the message said, I just wanted to say thank you for being respectful last night. A lot of men get defensive when I bring up energy alignment. I read it twice. I typed back, no problem. I appreciate the honesty. There was a typing indicator for a few seconds, then it disappeared. No further message. That should have been the end of it. And for the most part, it was. We didn't talk again. I didn't see her again. But the interaction stuck with me more than I expected. Over the next few days, I found myself noticing how often astrology came up in casual conversation. Someone mentioning Mercury retrograde when a meeting got rescheduled, a coworker joking about being such a Capricorn, ads for birth chart readings popping up on my social media. I wasn't new to this stuff existing. I just hadn't realized how seriously some people took it, how it could move from being a conversation starter to an actual decision-making tool. I thought about the way she'd said she didn't like wasting time, the confidence in her voice, the way she framed it like a boundary she'd learned through experience. It made me wonder what those experiences had been, what kind of relationships had convinced her that a crystal in a pouch was a reliable filter. I also thought about myself, about how I just accepted it. I hadn't pushed back, I hadn't asked questions. I'd said okay and let her leave. Part of that was politeness, part of it was disbelief. But part of it, if I was honest, was something else. A quiet fear of arguing with someone who was that certain of their worldview, like there was no entry point for discussion. A few nights later, Mark and I met for a drink. He brought it up again, still amused by it. So, he said, have you checked your horoscope lately? I rolled my eyes. Very funny. He laughed, then got more serious. Does it bother you? I thought about it before answering. Not the rejection, I said. Just how absolute it was. He nodded. Yeah, that would mess with me too. I didn't say anything else. I finished my drink. The conversation moved on. But the thought stayed with me, sitting somewhere in the back of my head, unresolved. About a week after that drink with Mark, I saw her again. Not in person. On my phone. I was half paying attention, scrolling during a lull at work when her profile popped up in my people you may know section on another app. Different platforms, same pictures, same rooftop bar photo, same hiking shot. I almost kept scrolling, but curiosity won. Her bio was longer this time, more specific. She listed her sign, her rising sign, her moon sign. There was a line about being deeply intuitive and another about protecting my energy at all costs. At the end, she wrote, if you don't believe in astrology, we won't align. I stared at it longer than I meant to. It felt less like a warning and more like a challenge, like she was daring people to disqualify themselves before she had to do it. A few minutes later, I got a notification, a message from her. Hey, it said. Funny running into you here. I sat back in my chair. I didn't answer right away. I wasn't sure why she was reaching out. She'd been pretty clear about not wanting to continue anything. I waited until after work to respond. I wrote, yeah, I noticed that too. Her reply came fast. I hope it's not weird that I messaged you. It's fine, I wrote. I was surprised, that's all. There was a pause, longer this time. Then she sent, I've been thinking about our date. I felt a small, stupid tightening in my chest. Not excitement, just a tension. Like when someone taps you on the shoulder unexpectedly. Okay, I wrote. I don't think I handled it as gently as I could have, she said. I was very activated that day. I didn't know what activated meant in this context, but I let it go. She followed up with, I'm not saying I was wrong, just that I was abrupt. I read the message a few times. There was no apology in it, just an explanation that centered on her internal state. I understand, I typed. Another quick reply. Most people don't. That line stuck out to me. It felt like a hook, like she was separating me from an imaginary group of people who didn't get her. We exchanged a few more messages, light stuff, work, how the week was going. She asked if I'd been on any other dates. I answered honestly. I asked the same. She said she was being intentional and taking a break. Then she said, I want to ask you something and you can say no. Okay, I wrote. Would you be open to learning more about astrology? Not for me, just for yourself. I stared at that for a while. The phrasing bothered me. Not for me felt unnecessary, like she was trying to preempt something. I don't know, I wrote. I've just never been into it. That's what everyone says at first, she replied, before they realize how accurate it is. There it was. The shift. Subtle but clear. I'm not trying to convert you, she added quickly. I just think it could help you understand some patterns in your life. I thought about my life. It seemed pretty understandable already. What kind of patterns? I asked. Relationship dynamics, she said. Why certain connections feel intense and then collapse. Why you attract certain types of people. I didn't respond immediately. I could see where this was going, and I wasn't sure I liked it. She sent another message before I could answer. For example, Leo men often struggle with control issues without realizing it. I felt my jaw tighten. I don't think that's fair, I wrote. You don't really know me. I'm not talking about you specifically, she said. I'm talking about archetypes. That didn't make it better. Over the next few days, the messages kept coming. Not constantly, but consistently. She'd send an observation, then a question. She asked what time I was born. I said I didn't know. She suggested I ask my parents. She said it mattered for accuracy. When I pushed back, gently, she framed it as curiosity. When I hesitated, she framed it as resistance. She used words like blocks and defensiveness. She told me she sensed I was closed off to growth. At one point, she wrote, I think you're more open than you realize. You just have some fear around surrendering control. That annoyed me more than anything else she'd said. Not because it hurt, because it assumed something about me and treated it like fact. I started responding less. Shorter messages, neutral replies. She noticed. Did I say something that triggered you? She asked. No, I wrote. I've just been busy. That's usually what people say when something lands, she replied. I stared at the screen, feeling a mix of irritation and something else I didn't like admitting. Doubt. Not about astrology, about myself, about whether I was being unfair or closed-minded. That night, she sent a longer message, a paragraph. She wrote about her last relationship, how she'd ignored astrological red flags, how she tried to be rational, how it ended with her feeling drained and confused. She said learning to trust her tools saved her years of pain. I see a lot of potential in you, she wrote, but only if you're willing to look at yourself honestly. I put my phone down. I didn't answer until the next morning. I don't think this is going to work, I wrote. I respect your beliefs, but they're not mine. Her reply came an hour later. That's disappointing, she said. I thought you were different. There it was again. That subtle repositioning, me as a letdown, me as someone who failed a test I hadn't agreed to take. I am different, I wrote before I could stop myself. Just not in the way you want. She didn't respond after that, not right away. 2 days later, she sent one final message. If you ever decide you're ready to grow, you know where to find me. I read it once, then again. Something about that sentence sat wrong in my stomach. Like the door she was offering wasn't actually open, just hovering there as a reminder that she believed she was ahead of me, looking back. I didn't reply. I unmatched her. I blocked her. But even after that, the words lingered, ready to grow, open, resistant, control. They followed me longer than I wanted to admit. Blocking her should have ended it. I expected the feeling to fade the way these things usually do. Instead, it sharpened. I started noticing myself second-guessing small interactions, not just dating, work conversations, friendships, moments where someone disagreed with me. Her voice crept in, reframed as a question. Was I being defensive? Was I resisting growth? Was I trying to control the narrative? I hated that. I hated how quickly it happened. About 2 weeks later, I got an email from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line was my first name. I almost deleted it without opening it. Curiosity won again. It was from her. She wrote that she'd realized I'd blocked her and wanted to respect my boundaries, but she also felt compelled to reach out one last time. She said she wasn't trying to push anything, just to offer clarity. I could have stopped reading there. I didn't. She said she'd pulled my chart using an estimated birth time based on our conversation. She admitted it wasn't ideal, but said the themes were remarkably consistent. She told me she felt a responsibility to share what she'd seen, especially since she sensed I was at a crossroads in my life. I felt my neck get hot as I read. Not fear, anger, a quiet, steady kind. She wrote about my dominant fire energy and how it could come across as confidence while masking insecurity. She said this often led to power struggles with women who were more emotionally intuitive. She said my resistance to astrology was itself evidence of the pattern. I hadn't told her my last name, I hadn't told her where I worked, but she was speaking like she had access to something private. I scrolled back up to the top of the email, checking the address again. It wasn't a work email, just a personal one. I tried to remember if I'd ever shared it, maybe through the app, maybe not. At the end of the message, she wrote, "You don't have to respond. I just felt guided to send this." Guided, that word again. Like responsibility without accountability. I didn't reply. I marked the email as spam and closed my laptop. My hands were shaking slightly, which annoyed me. I didn't want her to have that effect. That night, I slept badly, not because I believed what she'd said, because I kept replaying how confident she'd sounded, how every possible reaction I might have had was already accounted for in her framework. Agreement meant alignment. Disagreement meant resistance. Silence meant fear. There was no neutral ground. A few days later, I was at a small gathering at a friend's apartment. Nothing big, 5 or 6 people. Someone brought up astrology while we were sitting around the kitchen island. Normally, I would have tuned it out. This time, I stayed quiet, listening. One woman was explaining compatibility between signs. Another chimed in with stories about X's and charts. It was all casual, light, but I felt myself tense up anyway. When someone asked my sign, I hesitated before answering. "Leo?" I said. There was a brief reaction, a laugh, a comment about confidence. Nothing serious. But my chest tightened like I'd just been evaluated. On the way home, I realized how far this had gone. One date, a handful of messages, and somehow she'd managed to insert herself into how I saw myself being seen. I considered responding to the email, not to engage, just to tell her to stop. to draw a clean line. I didn't. Part of me worried that any response would be used as further proof of whatever narrative she had about me. Another week passed, then another. I started dating again. Nothing serious. A couple of first dates, one second date. With each one, there was a moment where I waited for the question, when's your birthday? When it came up, I answered casually. If astrology followed, I kept it light. If it didn't, I relaxed. One night, after a decent date that ended with a hug and a text me, I checked my phone and saw another email from her. Different subject line this time. Boundaries? I opened it despite myself. She wrote that she'd been reflecting on our dynamic and realized I might have felt invaded. She apologized for that. A real apology this time, maybe. It was hard to tell. Then she wrote, at the same time, I want to be clear that my insights came from a place of care, not control. There it was, the turn. She said blocking her had been a strong reaction and wondered what it brought up for me. She said it mirrored a pattern she'd seen in my chart around cutting off connection rather than working through discomfort. I felt something in me snap, not explode, just click into place. I typed a response, short, clear. I told her not to contact me again. I said any further messages would be unwanted. I didn't explain. I didn't argue. I hit send before I could rethink it. Her reply came the next day. I hear you, she wrote. I hope one day you'll understand why this felt necessary for me to say. Necessary. Always necessary. I didn't respond. I blocked the email address. I changed my app settings. I locked everything down. That should have been the end. But the escalation wasn't in the messages anymore. It was in my head. The proof came in the most ordinary way possible. That's what made it harder to dismiss. About a month after the last email, I got a LinkedIn notification. Someone had viewed my profile. I clicked out of habit. It was her. Same photo, same name, same job title, though she'd added holistic consultant to the end of it. I stared at the screen, my stomach dropping in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with recognition. She'd found my full name. I closed the app and tried to shake it off. LinkedIn shows profile views all the time. It wasn't illegal. It wasn't even confrontational, but it crossed a line she shouldn't have been able to see. That night, I checked my privacy settings. I tightened them. I told myself that was enough. 2 days later, Mark texted me a screenshot like, hey, he wrote, like, do you know this person? The screenshot was of an Instagram story, her account. I recognized the aesthetic immediately. Neutral colors, soft lighting, crystals laid out on a wooden table. The caption read, when you ignore energetic misalignment, you invite chaos disguised as connection. Below it, smaller text, fire-dominant men often mistake control for confidence. Healing begins with accountability. My heart started pounding. Not because it was vague, because it wasn't. Mark followed up. She just followed me. Mutuals, I guess? I sat on my couch, phone in my hand, staring at the screen. I hadn't told Mark her last name. I hadn't connected them. The only way she could have found him was through me. I wrote back, yeah, I know her. Everything okay? He asked. Yeah, I lied. Just weird. I opened Instagram on my own phone and searched her name. Her account was public. I scrolled post after post, long captions about boundaries, alignment, masculine resistance, emotional labor. The language was familiar now. The same words she'd used with me, repackaged for an audience. Then I saw a post from 3 days earlier. It was a photo of a coffee mug on a desk. In the background, slightly out of focus, was a notebook. On the cover, written in black marker, was my first name. Not a common one. The caption talked about working through a recent energetic attachment and releasing patterns that no longer serve. She wrote about a man who was intellectually defensive and unable to surrender control. She said letting go was an act of self-respect. I felt cold all over. This wasn't a metaphor. This wasn't astrology in the abstract. This was me, without my consent, without my knowledge, turned into content. I kept scrolling, my jaw clenched. In the comments, people were affirming her, thanking her, saying things like, this resonates so deeply and you're so brave for sharing. One comment stood out. Someone asked, was he a Leo? She replied with a crystal emoji and a fire emoji. Nothing else. That was it. That was the moment where any lingering doubt evaporated. She hadn't just rejected me. She hadn't just tried to convert me. She'd absorbed me into a narrative where she was the authority and I was an example. I took screenshots. All of it. The post, the comments, the story highlights. I didn't know what I'd need them for yet. I just knew I needed a record. I texted Mark and told him not to engage. I explained briefly that things had gone further than I'd realized. He was quiet for a bit, then wrote, that's not okay. That helped more than he probably knew. The next day, I got a message from a woman I'd gone on one date with a few weeks earlier. We hadn't clicked, but we'd parted politely. Random question, she wrote. Have you ever dated someone really into astrology? Like, intensely? I stared at the message. Why? I asked. She hesitated, then sent a voice memo. I listened to it twice. She said she'd been following a wellness account that talked a lot about toxic, masculine energy and astrological patterns. She said one of the recent posts described a guy she dated briefly. The details lined up too closely to ignore. Same job field, same age range, same habit of tapping fingers when nervous. I don't know if it's you, she said at the end, but it freaked me out. I felt sick. That was the proof, not just that she was talking about me, but that she was doing it systematically, turning private interactions into generalized lessons, then inviting strangers to diagnose and judge. I replied to the woman and told her carefully that yes, I thought we might be talking about the same person. I didn't elaborate. She thanked me and said she was unfollowing the account. That night, I sat at my desk with the screenshots open on my laptop. I read through everything again, slower this time. I noticed how often she framed herself as intuitive and others as resistant, how disagreement was always evidence of a flaw, how her certainty never wavered. This wasn't about astrology. That was just the language she used. This was about control. I drafted an email, then deleted it. I drafted another, deleted that too. There was no version of confrontation that ended cleanly. Any response would be reframed. Any objection would be proof of my supposed issues. So I did the only thing that made sense. I documented everything, dates, messages, screenshots, names. I saved it all to a folder and backed it up. Not to use, not yet, just in case. For the first time since the date, I felt grounded, not calm, but clear. Whatever this was, it wasn't mutual misunderstanding anymore. It was something real, and it had crossed into my life without my permission. Once I admitted to myself that it was real, the emotional fallout hit all at once instead of gradually. It wasn't dramatic, it was heavy, like something settling into my chest and refusing to move. I stopped sleeping well, not because I was scared she'd show up somewhere, but because my mind kept replaying conversations, rewriting them with new subtext. Things she'd said that had sounded harmless now felt loaded, compliments that doubled as diagnoses, questions that weren't really questions. I kept thinking about the first date, the crystal on the table, how calm she'd been when she said we shouldn't continue. At the time, I'd interpreted that calm as confidence. Now it felt more like authority, like she'd already placed me into a category and was acting accordingly. I started feeling embarrassed. Not the surface level kind you joke about later, the deeper kind that makes you question your judgment. I'd considered myself fairly good at reading people. I wasn't reckless, I didn't overshare, and yet I'd let someone with almost no access to me define me publicly, even if indirectly. At work, my concentration slipped. I'd reread the same email 3 times without processing it. I found myself scanning meeting rooms when I walked in, a reflex I didn't like. She'd never threatened me, she'd never raised her voice. And still, my body was reacting like something unsafe had happened. I didn't tell many people. Mark knew the basics. One other close friend knew a stripped down version. I didn't want to sound dramatic. I didn't want to be the guy who made a big deal out of some astrology girl. That framing alone bothered me. It minimized what had actually happened and made it easier to dismiss my own reaction. One night, I opened the folder where I'd saved everything and went through it again. This time, I wasn't looking for proof. I was looking for patterns. Every message from her followed the same shape: observation, interpretation, conclusion. And the conclusion always positioned her as insightful and me as unaware. Even her apology emails contained analysis of my behavior. I noticed something else too. There was never curiosity about how I felt, only assertions about what I felt, filtered through her system. That realization brought a wave of anger I hadn't let myself feel yet. Not explosive, focused. I went for a long walk that night through quiet streets, phone in my pocket, hands clenched. I replayed the Instagram posts in my head, the comments from strangers, the way she'd replied with emojis instead of words when asked if the post was about a Leo. I imagined those people forming opinions about me, about a version of me she'd curated. By the time I got home, I felt exhausted, drained in the exact way she'd claimed she was protecting herself from. The irony wasn't lost on me. The next week, I noticed a shift in how I approached dating. I was more guarded, not in a healthy, measured way, in a tight way. I avoided talking about anything personal too quickly. When someone asked questions that leaned towards psychology or growth, my shoulders tensed. On one date, a woman asked what I'd learned from my past relationships. A normal question. I gave a vague answer and immediately hated myself for it. This wasn't who I wanted to be. Closed off, defensive, hyper aware of how I might be interpreted. I started questioning my reactions. Was I overreacting? Plenty of people talk about exes online. Plenty of wellness influencers generalize. Maybe I should have just ignored it. Then I remembered the notebook with my name on it. That snapped me back. The emotional impact wasn't just about her. It was about how easily a narrative could be imposed on someone and accepted by others, as long as it was wrapped in the right language. Healing, growth, alignment. Those words sounded benign. They weren't neutral in her hands. One evening, I got a notification that she'd viewed my profile again on another platform. I'd forgotten to lock that one down. I felt something sink in my stomach. Then immediately something else followed. Resolve. I didn't spiral this time. I didn't reread messages. I took a screenshot, added it to the folder, and closed the app. That was the moment I realized I'd crossed a line internally, from reacting to preparing. I wasn't planning revenge. I wasn't plotting confrontation. I just wanted my sense of self back. The version of me that didn't flinch at a question about my birthday. I booked a session with a therapist, not to talk about astrology, to talk about boundaries, about how someone could get under my skin without raising their voice, about why certainty delivered calmly could feel more destabilizing than open hostility. Saying it out loud helped. Hearing myself describe the progression step by step made it clearer. The therapist didn't laugh. She didn't minimize it. She called it what it was, a violation of emotional boundaries, followed by public reframing. That validation loosened something in me. I still felt angry. I still felt exposed, but I didn't feel crazy anymore. Like the fallout wasn't explosive. It was quiet, lingering. It showed up in moments where it didn't belong. A hesitation before trusting. A flash of irritation when someone spoke too confidently about who I was. I knew it wouldn't last forever, but I also knew it wouldn't disappear on its own. Something had shifted, not broken, shifted, and I was going to have to decide what to do with that. The external consequences showed up quietly, then all at once. It started with a message from my manager asking if I had a few minutes to talk. Nothing alarming in the wording, but my stomach tightened anyway. We sat down in one of the small conference rooms after lunch. He closed the door, which he didn't usually do for casual check-ins. I want to be clear, he said, hands folded on the table. This isn't disciplinary, it's informational. That phrase alone raised my pulse. He told me someone had reached out to HR with concerns about a workplace dynamic involving me. Not a complaint exactly, more like a warning. The language was vague, heavy on buzzwords, emotional intelligence, power imbalance, interpersonal awareness. None of it included specifics, no dates, no incidents, just impressions. I asked where it came from. He hesitated, then said, it wasn't anonymous. He told me her name. She didn't work at my company. She'd never met anyone there. But she'd framed the message as concern for future interactions, saying she felt ethically obligated to share insights about someone she'd observed closely. Observed. That word made my jaw tighten. HR hadn't acted on it. They'd flagged it as unusual. But once something is written down, it exists. That was the point they made, carefully, like they didn't want to scare me but also didn't want to lie. I walked back to my desk afterward in a fog. The office looked the same. People typing, phones ringing, someone laughing near the printer. None of it matched what was happening in my head. She'd taken it there. I emailed HR myself that afternoon. I didn't accuse, I documented. I explained the limited nature of our interaction. I referenced the online posts without linking them. I attached screenshots of messages and emails. I kept the tone neutral, factual. They responded the next day, thanking me for the context and confirming that no action was being taken. They assured me the note would remain inactive unless further reports surfaced. Inactive wasn't the same as erased. A week later, I heard from the woman I'd dated briefly, the one who'd recognized herself in the posts. She asked if I'd be willing to talk, just to compare notes. We met for coffee in a public place. She was nervous. So was I. We spoke carefully at first, like two people handling something fragile. Within 10 minutes, it was clear our experiences followed the same arc: initial charm, heavy emphasis on intuition, early labeling, escalation framed as insight, withdrawal reframed as resistance. She showed me messages on her phone, different words, same structure. She told me I was emotionally avoidant, the woman said, after 2 dates. She told me I was afraid of surrender, I said. We sat there, quiet for a moment. She's done this before, the woman said finally. I talked to someone else. That someone else turned into 2 more, then 3. None of them wanted drama. None of them wanted confrontation. They just wanted to understand what had happened to them without feeling stupid. We started a group chat, low-key, just sharing information, dates, screenshots, posts, patterns. The picture that formed wasn't criminal. It wasn't something you could take to the police or a lawyer and expect action. It was something slipperier. Reputation damage through implication, authority without credentials, accusations disguised as care. One of the men in the group worked in a small industry. He told us he'd lost a contract after a mutual acquaintance mentioned concerning things they'd seen online. Nothing explicit, just enough doubt to make someone hesitate. Another woman said she'd confronted her directly and been told she was reenacting her wound. Every response followed the same logic. If you agreed, she was right. If you disagreed, she was still right. We talked about reporting her account, about responding publicly, about doing nothing. Doing nothing felt safest. It also felt wrong. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want to destroy her. I wanted the reach to stop. One of the women suggested we speak to the platform, not as individuals, but together. Not accusing her of harassment, but of repeated targeted content using identifiable details. We drafted a shared statement, factual, calm. We attached examples. We sent it in. Weeks passed with no response. In the meantime, her following grew. Her language sharpened. She started offering paid readings, coaching sessions. She talked about calling in aligned masculine energy and protecting women from subtle harm. I watched quietly, documenting everything. I felt detached in a way that surprised me, like I'd moved from participant to observer. Then a journalist reached out. She emailed me through a contact form on my personal website. She said she was working on a piece about the wellness industry and asked if I'd be open to sharing an experience involving public reframing and astrology-based authority. I didn't respond immediately. I talked to the group. Opinions were mixed. Exposure could help. Exposure could backfire. I thought about HR, about the note that would never fully disappear, about the way her words had already traveled farther than mine. I agreed to talk, on background, no names, no identifying details. The interview lasted an hour. I told the story straight through, from the date to the Instagram post to the HR email. I didn't editorialize. I let the sequence speak for itself. When it was over, I felt wrung out, not relieved, just empty. The article came out a month later. It didn't mention her. It didn't mention me. But the behavior was there, described clearly. The pattern, the harm. A few days after it was published, her account went private. Shortly after that, several posts disappeared. She never contacted me again. At work, nothing further happened. Life resumed its shape. But something had changed permanently. The consequences weren't loud. They didn't explode. They settled. They altered the ground I walked on. I'd learned how quickly someone could define you and how slow the process of undefining yourself could be. And I knew without question that I'd never let that happen quietly again. After everything settled on the outside, the real work started on the inside. That part was harder to measure and easier to ignore, which is probably why it took me longer to admit it was happening. On the surface, things were fine. I was functioning, sleeping better, going to work, seeing friends, dating occasionally. No more emails, no more profile views, no new posts that felt aimed in my direction. The immediate threat, if you could call it that, was gone. But something in me stayed braced. I noticed it in small moments first. A delay before responding to a text, a tightening in my chest when someone spoke with certainty about emotional truths, a flicker of suspicion when a date used language like growth or healing, even casually. It wasn't rational, I knew that. These were just words, but they'd been used on me like instruments, and my body remembered that before my mind caught up. In therapy, I struggled to describe it without minimizing it. I kept wanting to say, it wasn't that bad, and then list all the reasons it could have been worse. The therapist stopped me one session and asked why I felt the need to downplay it. I didn't have a good answer. What I did have was a growing awareness of how much power I'd given away without realizing it. Not through belief, but through deference. I'd assumed that because she spoke calmly, because her language sounded thoughtful, because she framed everything as care, she deserved the benefit of the doubt. That assumption cracked something open for me. I'd always thought of manipulation as loud or aggressive, someone pushing, demanding, overtly controlling. I wasn't prepared for how effective it could be when delivered gently, with a vocabulary that made disagreement sound like pathology. Once I saw that, I couldn't unsee it. I started reviewing other relationships in my life through that lens, not just romantic ones, professional dynamics, friendships, moments where someone else's certainty had overridden my own discomfort, and I'd gone along with it because it felt easier than pushing back. It wasn't that those people were malicious. It was that I'd learned to prioritize being reasonable over being grounded, to assume that if someone sounded sure enough, they must know something I didn't. That realization made me uncomfortable in a different way. It implicated me without blaming me. I hadn't caused what happened, but I'd been vulnerable to it. That vulnerability showed up in my dating life more clearly than anywhere else. I found myself scanning for red flags constantly, not in a healthy, discerning way, in a hyper-vigilant way. One woman mentioned she read charts for fun. My interest shut down immediately. Another joked about Mercury retrograde. I laughed, but internally I was already pulling back. It wasn't fair to them, and I knew it. But fairness didn't override the instinct to protect myself. At the same time, I felt a growing resistance to being defined at all. I bristled when people made broad statements about men, about personalities, about patterns. Even when I agreed with the sentiment, something in me pushed back. I didn't want to be a type anymore. That need bled into my sense of identity. I started asking myself questions I hadn't bothered with before. What did I actually believe about myself? Not in reaction to her, not in defense, but independently. The answers weren't dramatic, they were mundane. I was thoughtful, sometimes guarded, generally well-intentioned, occasionally stubborn, capable of listening and also capable of disengaging when something didn't feel right. None of that needed a system to explain it. And yet, I realized how tempting systems were, how comforting it could be to slot people into categories and let the framework do the work. It reduced uncertainty, it removed responsibility. If something went wrong, the explanation was already waiting. I understood finally why she'd clung to it so tightly. That understanding didn't make me sympathetic, it made me cautious. There were moments when I caught myself adopting the same posture she had, in smaller ways, interpreting someone's behavior instead of asking about it, assuming motives instead of checking. The difference was that once I noticed it, I stopped. That felt like progress. Still, there was grief in it. Not for her, for the version of myself that had walked into that date without armor, that had assumed good faith as a baseline rather than a variable. I didn't want to lose that openness completely. I just wanted to make it conditional. One night, months later, I was on a date with someone new. We were sitting in a quiet bar, talking about childhoods. She asked when my birthday was. The question landed heavier than it should have. I answered anyway. She smiled and said, "Oh, same month as my sister." And that was it. No analysis, no interpretation, no pause to assess alignment, just a fact, exchanged and then left behind. I felt something in my chest loosen, not dramatically, just enough to notice. Driving home later, I realized how much energy I'd been spending guarding against a repeat, how much bandwidth it took to stay on alert. The absence of that tension felt unfamiliar but welcome. The internal impact of what happened wasn't a wound that closed cleanly. It was more like a recalibration, a shift in how I related to certainty, to language, to authority dressed up as insight. I became more comfortable saying no without explaining myself, more willing to let people be wrong about me, less interested in correcting narratives I didn't consent to. That last part was the hardest, letting go of the urge to defend myself against versions of me that existed only in someone else's head. I thought about her less as time went on, not because I forgave her or understood her better, but because she stopped occupying space in my internal landscape. She became what she always should have been, a brief, unsettling encounter that revealed something important. The psychological impact wasn't about fear anymore. It was about discernment. I trusted myself differently now, not more blindly, more deliberately. And that changed how I moved through the world in ways I was still discovering. The permanent decision didn't arrive in a dramatic moment. There was no confrontation, no declaration, no final message typed and deleted 10 times. It came together slowly, then all at once, like something that had been forming underneath my awareness, finally breaking the surface. I was sitting in my apartment one Sunday afternoon, doing nothing in particular, laundry half folded, music playing low. I'd been thinking about whether I wanted to keep dating at all for a while, not in a cynical way, just in a tired one. The apps felt louder than they used to. Everyone seemed to arrive with a framework already built, ready to slot someone into it. I opened one app out of boredom and scrolled for a few minutes. Profiles blurred together, keywords jumped out at me. Evolved, aligned, high vibration, emotionally fluent. None of it was inherently bad, I knew that, but my body reacted before my brain could intervene. I closed the app and set my phone down. What I realized in that quiet moment was simple and uncomfortable. I no longer felt obligated to participate in spaces that required me to be interpreted before I could be known. That was the decision. Not to withdraw from people, not to swear off dating, but to stop engaging with anyone who claimed early authority over who I was, what I needed, or where I was at in my growth. It sounds obvious written out like that. It didn't feel obvious at the time. It felt like giving up a certain kind of access, a willingness to be open on someone else's terms. I thought about how many times I'd stayed in conversations longer than I wanted to, just to prove I wasn't closed-minded, how often I'd explained myself to avoid being mischaracterized, how much energy I'd spent trying to be legible to people who had already decided what they were seeing. I didn't want to do that anymore. So I made some changes, not performative ones, quiet ones. I updated my dating profiles. I removed anything that could be read as an invitation to psychoanalyze me. I added a line that said, I valued direct communication and didn't resonate with being categorized early. I didn't mention astrology. I didn't mention what had happened. I kept it plain. I stopped answering questions I didn't want to answer just to be polite. If someone asked about my relationship wounds on the first date, I said I preferred to let things unfold naturally. If that was a problem, I let it be a problem. The first few times I did that, it felt wrong, like I was being difficult or withholding or arrogant. Then it started to feel like relief. There was one date in particular that cemented it, and we were sitting across from each other mid-conversation when she said, I'm very good at reading people. I felt that familiar tightening in my chest. The old version of me would have smiled and nodded, waited to hear what she saw. Instead, I said, that might be true, but I'm not interested in being read. She looked surprised, not offended, just caught off guard. What do you mean? She asked. I mean, I'd rather be asked questions than interpreted, I said. She thought about that for a moment, then nodded. That's fair. We kept talking. No tension, no power struggle, just a small boundary, placed and respected. I drove home that night feeling lighter than I had after any date in months. The decision wasn't about her anymore. The woman with the crystals had become almost abstract in my mind, a catalyst rather than a character. The real shift was internal, a line I'd drawn that I didn't plan to erase. I stopped trying to correct narratives about myself that I hadn't agreed to. If someone misunderstood me and wasn't curious enough to check, I let the misunderstanding stand. That was new. It went against my instinct to clarify, to smooth things over. But I'd learned the hard way that not every misinterpretation deserved my participation. This decision affected other areas of my life. 2. At work, I stopped over-explaining choices I was confident in. With friends, I pushed back gently when jokes crossed into assumptions. Not defensively, just plainly. I don't think that's accurate, became a complete sentence. There were people who didn't like the change. A couple of dates fizzled out quickly. One person told me I seemed guarded. I accepted that. Guarded wasn't the worst thing to be. What mattered more was that I felt like myself again. Not the version of me reacting to someone else's framework, the version that trusted his own internal read of situations. I also made a quieter decision that I didn't talk about much. I stopped consuming content that framed personal growth as something only accessible through the right language or system. I unfollowed accounts that spoke in absolutes. I muted words that made my shoulders tense. It wasn't about rejecting introspection, it was about reclaiming it. Growth, I realized, didn't require an audience. It didn't require diagnosis. And it definitely didn't require someone else appointing themselves as an authority over my interior life. I never heard from her again. No more profile views, no indirect references, no mutuals reaching out with strange questions. She faded out the way people usually do, which felt fitting. The permanent decision wasn't to harden myself against people like her. It was to recognize them earlier and disengage without drama, to trust discomfort without needing to justify it, to walk away when something felt off, even if I couldn't articulate why yet. That was the part I'd missed before. I thought clarity had to come first, then action. I'd learned that sometimes action creates clarity. The date, the messages, the posts, the fallout, all of it led me to a place where I didn't need to prove anything to anyone, especially not my openness, especially not my growth. I wasn't behind. I wasn't resistant. I wasn't unaligned. I was done participating in narratives that required my erasure to function. That decision didn't announce itself. It settled in. And once it did, I knew it wasn't temporary. The aftermath didn't look like closure. There was no moment where everything clicked into place and felt resolved. It looked more like distance. Time doing what it does best when you stop interfering with it. Months passed without incident, no new information, no resurfacing. Her name stopped triggering anything when I heard it in passing, which surprised me more than I expected. It went from a spike of recognition to just another name. That felt like progress, even if it wasn't dramatic. Life filled in around the space she'd left behind. Work picked up, a friend moved away, another got engaged. The usual cycle of small events that slowly reasserts itself when nothing actively disruptive is happening. I kept dating, carefully, but not fearfully. Some connections fizzled, one turned into something steadier. Not perfect, not idealized, just consistent, easy in the way real things tend to be. Early on, I told her about the experience, not in detail, not all at once, just enough to explain why I was particular about certain language, why I valued being asked rather than assessed. She listened without interrupting. She didn't diagnose my reaction. She didn't tell me what it meant. That mattered more than I realized at the time. Occasionally, something would still surface, a phrase online, a conversation overheard at a bar, a post that leaned too hard on certainty. When it happened, I noticed it, felt the brief tension, then let it pass. I didn't spiral. I didn't collect evidence anymore. The folder on my computer stayed where it was, untouched. Eventually, I archived it. Not deleted, just moved out of reach. I never needed to use it. The group chat went quiet too, and one by one, people stopped checking in. Not because anything was unresolved, but because it no longer needed attention. We'd validated each other, compared notes, learned what we needed to learn, then we moved on. That felt like the healthiest ending possible. I thought about her occasionally, but not in the way you think about someone who hurt you. More like how you think about a strange detour you once took and never fully understood until later. I wondered what she was doing now, if her account stayed private, if she'd changed her language, if she ever questioned her certainty. Those thoughts didn't linger. They didn't need answers. What stayed with me was the awareness of how easily authority can be assumed and how tempting it is to let someone else tell you who you are when they speak confidently enough. That lesson didn't harden me. It clarified me. I became less interested in convincing people of anything, especially myself. When I look back at the date now, it feels almost absurd. The crystal, the table, the way the evening ended so abruptly. If I told the story to someone, without context, it would sound like a joke. And sometimes I let it be one, but I also know how far it went beyond that moment. How something small revealed something larger. Not about astrology or crystals or wellness culture in general. About power, about narrative, about how easily care can become control when it's not checked. I don't regret going on that date. That's the part that surprises people when I say it out loud. It wasn't a mistake. It was an education. I learned where my edges were. I learned how my body responds when something isn't right, even if my mind hasn't caught up yet. I learned that calm delivery doesn't equal safety, and that insight claimed without consent is still intrusion. Most importantly, I learned that I don't owe anyone access to my interior life just because they ask in the right tone. That knowledge didn't make my life smaller. It made it quieter, more spacious. If someone asks my birthday now, I answer without flinching. If they ask my sign, I tell them. If they want to talk about what it means, I decide in the moment whether I'm interested, not out of fear, out of choice. That difference matters. The story doesn't have a villain in the traditional sense. She didn't see herself that way. She probably still doesn't. In her version, she was guided, protective, aligned with something higher than interpersonal messiness. In my version, she was someone who crossed boundaries while believing she was honoring them. Both can be true at the same time. What matters is what I did with the experience once I was out of it. I didn't turn it into bitterness. I didn't turn it into a crusade. I didn't let it convince me that everyone who speaks about growth is dangerous. I let it refine me. There's a quiet confidence that comes from knowing you can walk away from something without needing to win the story, without needing to be understood by everyone involved. I have that now. The date didn't define me. The aftermath didn't either. What defined me was the way I responded once I saw the full shape of it. And that's where the story ends. Not with resolution exactly, with clarity, the kind that stays.